It starts, the U.S. Constitution of Catholic Bishops has called for the faithful throughout the country to observe a fortnight of freedom, a special period of prayer, study, catechism, and public action that will emphasize both our Christian and American heritage of liberty. The 2-week period stretches from tomorrow, June 21st, I told you how bad it was, to 2 days from now, Independence Day, July 4th, and will be bracketed by special masses in Baltimore and Washington, D.C. What are the bishops up to with this great national campaign of teaching and witness for religious liberty? In keeping with their responsibilities as shepherds of the faith, they are calling their people, and anyone else who pays heed, to a heightened awareness of the centrality of religious freedom for any civilized society that claims to recognize the equal dignity of human beings. But why now? Why should the bishops pick up this season for a campaign of public education and advocacy on the subject of religious liberty? For religious freedom watchers, that's an easy question to answer. We all understand that. Under President Obama, religious freedom has been directly attacked when it has not been simply neglected or disregarded. This, after all, is the administration. They go on to say what things that have taken place. The Obama administration, especially with the HHS mandate, poses the largest and most immediate threat to religious freedom in America today. But in the Easter week statement of their ad hoc committee on religious liberty, titled Our Most Important Cherished Liberty, the bishops also gave notice of other threats to which we should be alert. Among them are ill-considered state laws on immigration that would make it illegal for churches to assist poor people, to celebrate the sacraments with them if they are illegal immigrants. New York City has been discriminating against church groups that seek after-hours access to public school facilities on an equal footing with non-religious groups. And they go on to say a few other things. In short, the defense of religious freedom is more needed now than it has been for many years, and the confrontations between freedom and authority run deeply through layers of other political debates over sexuality, marriage, healthcare policy, discrimination law, humanitarian relief, and foreign affairs. New confrontations are bound to occur as long as our political system fails to restore and preserve a proper understanding of religious freedom. Such a restorative effort is the purpose of the Fortnight of Freedom. That's why Jann's here. That's why other speakers have been here. That's why we're here. As Archbishop William Murray of Baltimore, chairman of the ad hoc committee, said at the Bishops' annual conference in Atlanta, the fortnight is not about parties, candidates, elections. It is about the issue of religious freedom. Religious freedom knows no party. The bishops are responding to an aggressive secularism that happens to be led by a Democratic administration. Responding is the key word. For the bishops are not starting a fight, but neither are they backing away from one. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for being here, Joe. You've been here every day. Again, I apologize for being late. I was running late right from the get-go this morning, you know those days. And then I had to submit my timesheet, and we were having computer failure. And as much as I dearly love you all, I felt I had to get that resolved or I wouldn't get paid. And then the bridge and blah, 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 so thank you. I'd like to start with prayer, and so I'd ask in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, thank you for your gifts, the gifts that you give all of us to be able to speak about these matters within community. Thank you for the patience of those who have waited today. Thank you for the organizers of this really, really magnificent 2 weeks down here, and the amount of wisdom and knowledge that your Spirit imparts to us. We pray that you open our eyes and ears of hearts so that we hear your message and know how we are to act within our country as we face these very strong and very terrible threats to our ability to worship you, to be your presence to others, and to be the light of Christ within our communities. We give you thanks for all of our gifts. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so yesterday we started talking about this book, The 10 Universal Principles of Greek Philosophy of the Life Issues, by Father Robert Spitzer. He is a Jesuit and appears frequently on, I guess, EWTN. But when I was doing the research on him, I came across a rather interesting fact. He went to the same prep school that Obama did in Hawaii. And I find that very interesting, because you know how there's like that dearth of information about our president's background? It'd be very interesting to know what the yearbooks do say. So, we talk about philosophy being a study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence. We know that life issues are very important today. Those that are related to the human condition from the moment of conception, and especially around that time of birth, right through infancy, and through the time of diminished capacity through natural death. We talked about at the beginning of the 10 principles, and those were the principles of reason yesterday. And that the best principle is a complete explanation. So it's not, a good explanation of this chair would not be that it has black tubing. A better explanation would be it is a seating piece of furniture, it has black tubing and blue seats. That the more complete an explanation is, the better it is. Of non-contradiction, that I can say that this is a chair and a table at the same time. I can say it's a chair, I might use it as a table and then describe it as such, but you can't say it's a chair and a table at the same place, in the same point, at the same time. So you can't say that we need human embryonic stem cells from human embryos because they're not human and therefore require no protection. There's an inherent contradiction in that, and that should throw out those sorts of practices. And there's the principle of objective evidence. This is what calls us to say that we have to have verifiable, monitorable data to support our case. We can't say that I think that this chair is actually a merry-go-round because I want it to be a merry-go-round when we know it's a single unit chair. Okay? So those were the principles we looked at and how they apply to life issues yesterday. So today we're going to do the principles of ethics. Okay? And Father Spitzer puts these down into 3 basic principles. The principle of non-malfeasance, the principle of consistent means and ends, and the principle of full human potential. This principle, that of non-malfeasance, is suggested by Father Spitzer and regarded within the philosophical community as being fundamental to all other ethics, okay? It's grounded in the presumption that human beings have a very special, inherent, and intrinsic value, that's transcendent values. One of the things that are challenged right now is this. The principle of malfeasance is being eroded within our communities, within our healthcare, within our judicial system, because this subject right here, that human beings have a very special, inherent, and intrinsic value, is challenged. When we articulate something like that, we're called species supremacists. That's the actual name that they use, species supremacists. Peter Singer is the most well-known philosopher. I mentioned him yesterday. Somebody took some papers, I don't think she is here today, about his background. He's from Australia originally. He was a professor at Princeton. He got his big name and his big, accolades on the issues of animal rights. But he is the person who advocates within our culture today, from the platform of Princeton, that it is all right to proceed with abortion unfettered by any sort of regulation, rule, or anything else, as well as infanticide, because after all, Peter Singer would say, a baby that's close to birth, 0 to 2, can't predict the future, can't anticipate people's reactions, and therefore it should be a parent's right to dispose of their infant if they want to, because it's not really any greater of consequence than a dog or a cat or something else. When I first learned of this type of stuff within the past couple of decades, I would say I cannot go out on the road and talk about this stuff to people because they will think I'm that crazy woman from the diocese and that they should keep her home, okay? But more and more you see it in the paper. Just recently, two ethicists, so they call themselves, really resurrected his work again, talking about infanticide, saying that the justifications for abortion are equal to the justification for infanticide, and particularly if there's a disability, the parents should be able to make that decision. Unbelievable, but true. It says that this principle of Western, and yesterday we talked a lot about how in Western culture, we're based from, in Western civilization, the works of the philosophers dating back to Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, that this stuff is like 3,000 years old in just an academic perspective, and that it's the history of the Judeo-Christian ethic from the past 3,000 years that have brought us in civilization to where we are. So these are not like new principles that we're overlaying on society. This is what Western civilization, these principles, these ethics, that have allowed us to grow and develop into the countries that we were, and we are losing our capacity to be now. Principle of non-malfeasance says that human beings cannot be treated like inanimate objects or non-human animals. Okay? And one of the differences between a non-human animal and a human being this transcendent values. And what that refers to is that, you know how you have, like I got this puppy a year and a half ago, Lily Beth was her name. I was rather lonely, and there's nothing like them to come home and welcome you, is there, little dog? So Lily Beth is great if I'm playing with her, if I'm somehow entertaining her, even just talking to her across the room, for sure when I feed her. And when she wants to go out and take care of her natural needs. If none of those things are occurring, Lily Beth goes to sleep. And that's what animals mostly do. They don't use that time beyond the meeting of their basic needs to do anything other than kind of withdraw and shut down until that next opportunity arises. The fact that there is a transcendent value refers to the fact that, and after our basic needs are met, we will go on to perhaps paint, or perhaps compose music, or to discuss philosophical ideas, or to worship God, or to spend time with our family and friends in a loving relationship. Those are the transcendent values that separate us from the finest of monkeys, okay? And you'll hear this, all species, including human species, are the same argument. You'll hear because you see dolphins have speech and they can communicate, all right? So they're almost like humans, so we must be almost like animals, so we are animals. That's kind of how the argument goes. Or you'll hear monkeys can use tools. They'll pick up a tool and use it. That's probably all quite true, but that is not a transcendent manifestation of their being. That's meeting their basic need, and then they probably go to sleep, like Lily Beth. Another big challenge to the principle of non-malfeasance is made by materialists. And they say, look, all you are is a bunch of cells, tissues, organs. You have electrical and chemical impulses going on. We give you some neurotransmitters. You behave in a certain way. We take them away. We see another change in behavior. And that's just because you're nothing really more than some parts, bagged in a human body. All right? Again, it's that transcendency of our being that says, wait a minute, no, there's more to this than that. That we are more than the sum of parts. And this all, of course, is ethical discussion. And what ethics are is a branch of philosophy dealing with values relating to human conduct, with respect to the rightness and wrongness of certain actions, and to the goodness and badness of some motives and the ends of such actions. And you see, this is what is challenged within relativism, okay, the whole concept of ethics, where there is no absolute, for a relativist, there is no absolute right or wrong. There's only greater good and lesser evils, and then we kind of balance that all out. Unfortunately, it's usually balanced out by who has power. Okay, they get to call the tune. The principle of non-malfeasance. It's found in virtually all of the world's major religions. All right, this is like the huge, like big giant of ethical principles. It's the foundation for all other ethics. It's required for the foundation of all ethics because it is called the silver rule, and that is, do not, no, this is not the golden rule, but the silver rule. Do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. Okay? So, non-malfeasance, malfeasance is like, you can see the whole origin of the word. That we are not to do harm to one another, and if harm is unavoidable, then you need to minimize that harm. Avoid unnecessary harm. If harm is unavoidable, minimize it. So if I have to amputate so that I can save you from gangrene caused by diabetes, I'm not going to chop off your leg if all you need is to have a toe removed. A harmful procedure, but certainly one also that saves your life. To understand this, though, and the reason I talk about animals and what's happening in terms of species supremacists and that sort of thing, is that this is related to human persons. The principles and ethics in Western civilization are not related to dogs and cats. They're not related to mountains and streams, although it can be applied, like in the environmental movement and things like that. They're related to persons. And this is where things start to break down so very radically within our cultural ethical framework within the United States after Roe v. Wade, and we're going to look at that. Contemporary English dictionaries, okay? A human, if you look up what is a person, they'll say it's a human being. The word comes from Latin persona, which was equal to a human being or an individual. Very kind of common sense sort of move in that, when we talk about a person, we're thinking about a human. And this is where kind of the reality of a court decision is being applied to our societies, utilized within our structures, like our hospitals, within our med schools, within our society at large, and impacting upon the further development of ethics. This Roe v. Wade decision was so very important. It's important to understand it within the concept of non-malfeasance. Okay? What the court decided was that they were going to redefine, as we go through this, it'll make a bit more sense, redefine what a person is, and then if you can get rid of the person part of it, then you don't have to worry about the non-malfeasance part. Okay? So up until this time, most people thought having an abortion was a wrong thing. Maybe people had abortions, and we know that they did, but they knew that it was not a good thing. And Roe changed all that. Prior to Roe v. Wade, okay, there was no linguistic history. And those are people who study how words reflect reality and that whole interchange of shaping reality from word. So linguistics is important with philosophy being kept in mind. There's no history to separate person from being. As we just saw, it comes from persona. A person and a human being were considered synonymous. There is a common sense understanding, okay, that a human person is the result of human reproduction. So that nobody was like really surprised when you had a baby after you had sex, because we kind of anticipated that, and it had been our experience throughout life. What Roe did was it violated that common sense. Suddenly, there, within the Roe decision, there's like, well, what is this really that you're aborting? As though we didn't know. So a very common law, common sense idea of what is that product of conception was tampered with by the court. At the time the decision was made, they did not have the human genome sequenced yet, and they did not have the sensors that they need to be able to do that. But rather than waiting for conclusive evidence from science, saying we're going to defer on this decision until we know, is that baby really started completely at the time of conception, or does something happen during gestation that changes it into a more fully human being or into a human being? They did not know how to do that at that point, although again the common sense had told us, the historical evidence had told us, but they did not have scientific evidence that could point out the genome, the uniqueness and the fullness for a conceived baby. So they just went ahead and made a decision anyway. And a majority on the court then restricted the definition of a person. Since they didn't have scientific evidence, they did not relate to these issues, they decided that they were only going to deal with the definition of a person as a legal definition. So they kind of started with the philosophy part, but then they kind of flopped over. And if you look at the whole Roe decision and the subsequent consequences, you'll see that they'll make a twist in the reasoning. They'll violate a moral principle, which then opens the door to violate another principle, which gets you unrestricted abortion and potentially euthanasia. So they said, okay, so then we're going to deal with this. Since we don't have the scientific evidence, it's conclusive, we're going to look for a legal definition of what a human person is. And lo and behold, in the cases that had come before the Supreme Court in years past, they had never decided a case on a person as defined as a legal entity in personhood. So they looked for a new definition for a term in old cases, and you could never find it. It's a new term. Inherently, if you're using a new term, legal person, to represent an unborn human being, none of these cases had ever come before the court, so they couldn't find that definition. So then they figured they could just define or not define what a human person is, opening the way for the court to say, and this is what the law of the land will be. They tried to find a legal definition of personhood rather than relying on common sense and ontological, the essence of being, definitions. What's wrong with Roe v. Wade? Okay, correct reasoning is, and this we talked about yesterday, these are really basic philosophical exercises that if you take Logic 101, Socrates is a man, and it's therefore Socrates, that sort of thing. Persons are human beings. Human feti, the multiple of fetuses, in Latin, I hope you're all duly impressed. Human feti are persons, therefore a fetus is a person and therefore protected. That should be the logical conclusion. The court reasoned, that the definition of a person was to be restricted to that found in previous Supreme Court cases. And as I said, there was no legal precedence for person applied to fetus because these court cases have never been decided. Therefore, no fetus has legal protection. And that is how we got to where we are with 54 million deaths within our nation over the past 35 years. By refusing to acknowledge that unborn are human persons because of their origin and their full, unique human genome, which we now know today, which they knew by the time of the subsequent abortion cases that came before the court, an arbitrary definition of person was used. Ethics appropriate to human persons would require protection, and therefore they weren't going to use that whole person concept. And whenever the definition of human personhood is expanded to include other characteristics, it becomes exclusionary to some group of persons, and that would be like in race or functional capacity or development. So if I say personhood only extends to white people, the Dred Scott decision could still be held, and we could measure African American people as 3/5 of the value of a white person. That was, of course, overruled and thrown out. If I can say that personhood, you have to be able to anticipate the future, like Peter Singer says with those infants, and since an infant can't anticipate the future, then that infant is no longer required to have protections of the human person. So we can euthanize them at will. If I can say that Terry Schiavo, oh, she just really wasn't quite herself, and therefore she was not a human person because she could not engage in the same activity she had before she had her stroke, then we can starve her to death. Anytime, now there are two things to remember about personhood. There are personhood amendments. I think Colorado had one on their ballot this year, and another state may have had one or is about to. Those are saying, those ones that the pro-life community wants to see passed, say that personhood, they're like the antidote to this, that personhood begins at the moment of conception. So we want to have those go forward, those sorts of laws and rules in terms of our country. But what you hear within the culture and within the academy right now is personhood being used to be exclusionary. You are a person if you can respond to pain. So even if you're in a persistent vegetative state and you're not showing immediate response to being stuck with a pin, that can exclude you from protection. Anytime you hear that personhood, and it's not saying a fully unique human genome, that is enough to define you as a person. It's being used to exclude some group of the population. What's wrong with Roe v. Wade? Let me just get a... law must not undermine its most fundamental ethical standard. So you start to get the synergistic effect, or I should say actually a dialectical effect of the law starts to undermine the ethic, which leads to more poor law, which leads to a decline of ethical standards. Okay? And by not defining objectively what a person is, non-malfeasance can be disregarded to anyone not called a person. Get that? In sanctions, there's a sanctioning of justifying the non-presence of personhood on the basis of case precedents that had not considered the question. So, and this is probably from a legal point of view, the most distressing. I mean, it's just like kind of like a bad card trick where you can see what they did. You know, it's okay for us to make up this definition because we're going to relate to definitions that we're looking for in the law, but we can't find them, so we'll make it up. Whenever the definition of personhood is expanded to include other characteristics, it becomes exclusionary to some groups of persons. And history is replete with, you can only be considered a human person and get protections if you are of an Aryan descent, if you're not a gypsy, if you're not a homosexual, if you're, that's Nazism and what happened there. You can only be considered a human if you're born alive, but not if you're under the supervision of Peter Singer. It's always exclusionary. Violation and acceptance of the violation of the principle of non-malfeasance, which is, again, remember to first do, but it's first to do, not to do unto another as you would not have done unto yourself. Okay? That is what, and that sent the world into a tailspin, the legal world, over what, again, can be done and not done to all sorts of people within the country. All right, the second of the ethical principles is one probably known most of us who went to social studies prior to 1980. I don't even know if they teach this stuff anymore, but everybody knows about the prince. The ends justifies the means, right? Machiavelli's major work. Within Catholic social teaching, and you can see both St. Augustine and St. Aquinas both worked with this principle. It was formalized by St. Augustine, but again, one of those common sense sort of things that people intuitively knew. The ends do not justify the means, and it's fundamental to the whole of ethics that St. Thomas worked with in his Summa. One cannot use an unjust means to attain a just ends. The injustice of the means will undermine the justice of the end. Okay? So, I guess it's a little fancier way. One of the exceptions that are held by most philosophers and even within Catholic social teaching is one may not use an objectively wrong means to attain a just end if the end does not prevent a greater evil than the just end means one employs to achieve it. Okay? This is what's used to justify self-defense in war. In other words, I'm hiding Jewish people in my attic. The Nazis come to the door. Are there any Jews here? I say, no, Jews, what Jews? Okay? That's a case where the objectively wrong means, lying, okay, to attain a just end, the saving of life, if the end, okay, the saving of life, does not prevent a greater evil, the unjust mean one employs to achieve it. So my lie, there's nobody here, okay, is not worse than what would happen if I didn't employ the lie. If I then, let's say, I'm harboring a refugee, an illegal immigrant in my attic, and the INS comes and says, you have an illegal immigrant, and I take my revolver out of my pocketbook and shoot him dead, okay? All right, that could not be justified, because while I protected the illegal immigrant from who knows what, maybe he was running away from sex trafficking or something, that is too much. There's a greater evil occurring, the death of the INS men, than the protection of the rights of the illegal immigrant in my attic. Okay? Again, this is what justifies self-defense and just war. No, you would not want to necessarily kill someone entering your house, but if someone's breaking and entering your house and you're trying to defend the property and something happens, then although it is not a good thing in itself, it is an understandable and morally justifiable thing to have happen. The application of consistent ends and means, a woman's right to control her body is greater than the right of the fetus to live. Now we already know that the whole idea of personhood has been thrown out the window, and non-malfeasance has been thrown out the window because we can take the life of the infant. But if you're going to look at this just from consistent ends and means, is killing the fetus more or less evil than 9 months of pregnancy? You know, killing is an absolute condition. The custody of one's body that is transient just by a basis of time and space. This again would throw out Roe v. Wade. And as we look at some of these things, understand that this is why there's such an attack on religion in general and the Catholic Church for sure. As I've mentioned throughout the years to many of my friends, and I think we just saw it recently. So the bishops in the United States declare the fortnight for freedom, correct? Mm-hmm. Wouldn't you know that that's just the very same time that the Philadelphia sex abuse case gets decided and announced that the Monsignor was in violation of Catholic rule? Okay, and even more so, then we started to hear about the scandal of the butler in the Vatican. Did anybody catch this? Okay, it's like, and if you just watch what happens. Whenever the bishops, I think when, and it doesn't just have to be on beginning and end of life, when the Pope said, do not go to war with Iraq, do not invade Iraq, the scandal issue was totally brought up at that same time. Just watch, when the bishops of the Catholic Church in the United States or the Vatican makes a big statement, you watch it, it's within a day, there's something to discredit the Catholic Church, and those things are not coincidental. Vaccines from fetal tissues. Is it okay, now here's a good end, to make vaccines? The rubella vaccine right now is made from several generations away from tissue that was gleaned from an aborted fetus. Is it okay to use that rubella vaccine? In actuality, the Vatican was asked to actually make a rule by the Children of God people who campaigned throughout the United States that people not use the rubella vaccine. And the Vatican said because parents having their children inoculated against rubella are not only doing good things for their children in terms of preventing them from catching the disease, they are protecting the lives of unborn children who, if exposed to rubella, will have serious deficits. And the person choosing to use the vaccine is many, many steps removed, very distant from the choice to abort that child. And they said, if you have done due diligence to seek out alternative vaccines, and if you tell your physician when they are giving your child this rubella vaccine from fetal material, I object to the fact that these are being created from unborn children's cells, then yes, you are participating in an evil, but it is so far removed, and that the exception applies in that case. Okay? Human embryonic stem cell treatments, should they ever come up with one, would it be okay to use that? Is it okay to deliberately take the life of an unborn child, or deliberately mutilate the body of the woman donating an ovary to come up with a treatment? The answer to that has been clearly and unequivocally no. The final ethical principle is the principle of full human potential. And this becomes particularly critical to understand when you get to the end-of-life decision-making. Okay, and this, I have these strange parentheses showing up every here and again to check that. Every human being deserves to be valued according to the full level of human development, not according to the level of development currently achieved. Okay? So, what this says is that an unborn child deserves to be valued as he or she may be when they're 20 or 40 or 60, whatever their full level of achievement is going to be. That someone with Alzheimer's, who really can't focus and know or articulate, at least to you, that they are aware of who you particularly are, needs to be valued as equally as in the day that they greeted you with flowers when you came to their door. That we think about all persons as how we might most fully be, since all of us are both sinful and undeveloped, that we don't have the option to say that, well, the way you're functioning right now is how I can decide what I can or cannot do to or with you. Again, when you want to know why the church is so soundly rejected by people who are walking outside the ethical boundaries of Western civilization, you look at who developed these thoughts, who protected how the Irish State civilization. Not only were things recorded, but so much of the work in philosophy and in ethics and what undermines our laws and rules, how people and nations interact with each other, come from the church. Okay? The principle of full human potential was first articulated by a Dominican friar, Bartolomé de las Casas, and he objected to the less than human status that Spaniards were placing upon North and South American Indians during the 16th century, and by saying, well, they're not really human, they're Indians, they're natives, they're uncivilized, they're not human, so we can enslave them, kill them when they misbehave according to our standards, and do whatever we want. People never can be branded less than human. My first part of my career was spent in the Office of Mental Retardation and Developmental Disabilities out at developmental centers and DDSOs in the process of deinstitutionalization. I graduated college in '76, so that was very shortly after the Willowbrook scandals. And I worked at Wassaic, which was just north of New York City. So I actually saw where beds, like in a room this size, it would be easily 100 beds, just beds. I knew people who always had to hoard their things under their pillowcases, and because they were always afraid of being stolen from. I remember being asked if I was the type of staff member who had a big key. There would be these big keys that were like masters. Big key meant status, but big key also meant that you might get whacked really hard with a big key. And I knew people who were sterilized and who were sterilized and just moved willy-nilly wherever they, could be used. And used was it. If you were bright enough to go work in the kitchen, that you did. For 12 hours a day, that was too bad. There was no wages, too bad. And that's because they were branded by society, by the structure of the state, as being retarded and less than human. So it's not only, again, beginning and end of life, it's also how we look at those who are mentally handicapped, those who are physically challenged, those who are emotionally disturbed within our society. The principle of full human potential supports the principle of non-malfeasance. Because, again, you can say, well, right now I'm beginning a book, it's called The Undead. And it was a journalist's response to looking into the whole transplantation issues in the country. And they actually have, they being people within the academy, doctors and people involved with transplantation, they have developed protocol for review for harvesting the organs of the PVS patient. The PVS patient is a person who is in the persistent vegetative state. They do not respond to stimuli, but they have wake cycles. In research that was done says that so much tremendous energy needs to be expressed for them to respond because of brain impairment, that we don't really know whether they feel pain or not, because subsequent studies with brain scans will show parts of the brain being highlighted when stimuli is introduced. But they talk about and there's protocol that's being developed because it would be very disturbing to the doctors and nurses who are harvesting organs if they saw the patient wake. So you should sedate them and all these different things. Again, not making it up. It's in the literature right now and being introduced so that society can become acclimated to these concepts before they're totally put forward. But the only reason that can be even considered, is because the principle of full human potential. No one's saying in those circles, hey, wait a minute, even though Terry might be in the persistent vegetative state now, we need to respond to her as the child of God, the young woman that she is. So if you can knock out the full human potential, then it's much easier to break this principle as well. Because then there's no malfeasance if there's no human person. If there's no species supremacy, there's no extra specialness about being human, then you don't have to worry about what you're doing to one another because we're all just animals. It is attaching value to any lower level of development risks the possibility of undervaluing that human being. Does little Billy really need remedial services at school with his handicapping conditions? He's never going to be really human. He's never going to be fully human. And you start to see changes in the language as people start to justify their omission or commission of violence towards other people. And violation of this principle is used to justify all sorts of killing. I mean, again, you look through the history of the world, you see it quite consistently. In its application, we need to remember when arguing, and I use it as a discussion term, with people on abortion, that the unborn human has unknown and unlimited potential. A good question to ask is, what is the criteria for acceptable development? So what do you think? Oh, you think that somebody should be able to predict the future? Well, you know, my 15-year-old has a really tough time trying to predict the future, that he will be held accountable for his homework. Does that give me the, you know, the criteria I need to do whatever I want to him? Ignoring this principle asserts that the nature of a human being is determined by stage of development rather than by its ontological nature. All right? If we don't say that we're going to regard each one of us, regardless of whether we're an infant, child, old person, injured person, whatever, as who we are meant to be in an ordered world, in a created world without sin, then who's going to determine the stage of development that is the criteria that will be necessary to allow for continued existence? Yet once you move away from the authority of God and the hierarchical status of God, humans, animals, plants, and material, that leaves itself open to all sorts of abuse. Again, it comes down to then who has the power. Who has the power to make that determination? This is one of the things about healthcare law. These principles, as we go through all of this, these ethical principles, this healthcare law ignores many of these principles. So, if I say, let's see here, you know, you're 68 and we've already invested money by giving you a pacemaker a few years ago. Now you have cancer. I don't know. Your stage of development, you're pretty old. From my 40-year-old, you're at the age, okay, bureaucratic age. I think we're going to have to let you go, but don't worry, we'll keep you comfortable. Okay. Yeah, but be very, watch closely on these end-of-life regulations as they start to become circulated. It is a real risk as to how this is all going to play out based on your existing condition. You can't be denied insurance, but insurance doesn't have to pay for everything, remember. Consequences to the dignity of human person from conception to natural death. These are what happens when we violate any of the ethical principles, but particularly that of full human potential. And that's what Dr. Father Spitzer sees as being the most primary of the ethical principles. And in terms of time, I'd be happy to open up for discussion or questions. Tomorrow we will talk about the final principles and some of the other compelling questions of our culture. Yes?
I was told